Hi, and welcome to Itasca Waters. This is the fifth in a series of programs we are airing on ICTV, all on the general subject of shorelands in Itasca County. I'm your host, Jesse Davis, and I'm a member of the Itasca Waters Board, as well as a garlic farmer and a realtor at the Move It Real Estate Group here in Grand Rapids. This program is made possible by the nonprofit organization Itasca Waters and by the financial support of the Blandin Foundation. My guest today is Mike Casey. Mike is co-owner of Bunes Septic and a 21-year veteran in the industry. Today we will discuss, as part of Itasca Waters' ICTV series on shoreland, septic systems and their impact on our waters. Mike, thanks very much for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
So, we're kind of doing a Septic 101 primer here.
Sure.
And when we were talking earlier, you kind of gave me a nice trajectory to kind of encompass all the different sort of things that are involved with a septic system, or an SSTS, and we can go into what that means. But really, you say the game really changed in the mid-90s when the University of Minnesota, which had been working with a lot of rural communities and trying to figure out how these rural communities could keep their water from being damaged by systems that weren't really designed to do that. So
right.
Really moving from disposal to treatment.
Exactly.
And so, why don't you give us a little...
It really centers on treatment. It goes back as far as the early 70s when the University of Minnesota started to look at the impacts of wastewater on our groundwater and our lakes in particular. And the model that they, or the research that they did in those early days ended up becoming the model for not only the code in Minnesota, but for the country.
Really?
And yeah, it's used all over, and it's interesting to see some of the other states in our trade magazines and stuff are way behind us in terms of treatment. But with 10,000 lakes, they had an incentive to look at the impacts of wastewater on our lakes and the groundwater. And so they did research, and in the early days, from the time that outhouses went away and septic systems were being built, there really wasn't much concern given to what was happening with the wastewater. And it was out of sight, out of mind. As long as it went away, and nobody really seemed to care. And so the bigger concern was a toilet that flushed and worked properly. And what happened to it after that was not really given much thought. Well, the university, through their research, developed practical treatment methods and construction practices. And of course, they conducted seminars and programs with installers and professionals in the business in those early days, before there was any statutory regulations. They were trying to incentivize installers to do things the right way with treatment in mind rather than just disposal. And some of the early installers did that. But the majority of them, a lot of old timers, they had their own way. They knew how to build a system that worked. And when I say that, it's working from a disposal standpoint, not from a treatment standpoint. So eventually it became law in the mid-90s that systems built after that were required to have treatment. And what that essentially means, if we want to get into the nuts and bolts of how treatment actually works.
Well, yeah, because these septic systems, you think of a big wastewater treatment facility. I mean, I'm thinking they've got centrifuges or chemicals and stuff. Yes. And the septic system is not that.
It's much more simplified, but yet it's not completely simple. There's a lot of thought and design elements that go into it. But when you boil it down to its basic essence, you have a minimum of two components. You have a tank that is intended for separating the solids from the liquids. It does that simply by gravity. So as the flow from the house enters the tank, anything that's heavier than water will settle to the bottom. Anything that's lighter than water will float on the top. And this area in between we call a clear zone. And if you sample it, it is reasonably clear. Not clean, but clear. So that's the first phase of treatment, is separating solids. We had that in the old systems as well. But then that clear, what is referred to as effluent, flows to the drain field. In some cases it's pumped to a drain field. The actual treatment takes place in that secondary phase of the drain field. As the wastewater percolates down through the soil profile, the oxygen in the soil, aerobic bacteria, is responsible for consuming the pathogens in the wastewater.
So it's not just the sand or the gravel filtering it, it's actually an active...
It's somewhat of a filtering process, but the actual filter is the bacteria in the soil.
Okay.
And it's going to lead into your next question I get asked a lot, is why do I have to have a mound system when I've got good sand, I've got gravel? The old system worked great in the soil that I have. And in fact, for myself, when I was first learning about this, what kind of was my thought is, it's all going into the ground anyhow, what's the difference?
Yeah.
Well, the soil needs to be good soil, ideal soil, in order to support that oxygen. If you have what they call limiting factors in the soil, you reduce or eliminate the oxygen. So common limiting factors in our area would be what they call seasonally saturated, sometimes incorrectly referred to as high water table. But you can think of it that way. If the ground is wet, you don't have oxygen.
Okay.
And it can be, at certain points of the year, it might be favorable, but other times of the year it's not. So given that, or another limiting factor would be clay soils or rocky soils. And they define bedrock. We see a lot of that along the North Shore in Minnesota. But specifically what they define as bedrock is more than 50% rock in the soil. So without those, or if you have those limiting factors in the soil, you don't have the oxygen needed to support treatment. And so given, go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering, are these bacteria just naturally in the soil?
Naturally occurring.
If the conditions are right. It's not something that you, when you're designing a system, have to...
Well, that's a good question, because it leads into additional, I said there's at least two components. There are what we call advanced treatment systems that would add additional components to improve treatment, or perhaps cut down on waste strength if you have special circumstances. For example, a lot of people in a residential setting, group home or something like that, maybe a restaurant or a laundromat where you have lots of usage, then they go into these advanced treatment systems. And we can talk more about that, but it actually, one example of an advanced treatment system would be to add oxygen into the system through means of a blower, simply a bubbler that introduces oxygen into the septic tank and creates an aerobic bacteria in the septic tank.
So you've talked about mounds, and I certainly, as a realtor, see more and more mounds being the norm with newer homes. So let's talk about what the major kind of categories that there are. There's a mound system. There's a drain field. You talked about
gravity type system would be the most simple. If you have ideal soil, you have what we call vertical separation. That would be, you need 3 feet of clear, good soil below the drain field for that treatment to take place as the wastewater percolates through the soil profile. If that's the case, a gravity system is allowed. If you don't have that, then they have to create that soil profile above ground, or perhaps you see some mounds are fairly low, some are quite high. That is an indication of where that limiting factor is below grade in the soil profile. So if they find, yes, you have a limiting factor, but it's down at 24 inches, then you'll end up with a shorter or lower mound. But if it's right on the surface, they're going to have to create that higher mound.
And then when you have these drain fields or these mounds or things like that, what do you need to do to make sure that you're keeping them happy? I mean, you don't want to have trees growing in them, right? You don't.
That's one thing. A lot of people want to disguise that mound, hide it somehow.
Sure.
And it's okay to use vegetation to maybe hide it or enhance the look of your property. But they want to keep those major, like trees, for example, or large shrubs about 20 feet away from the edge of the mound.
Okay.
So the roots don't become a problem. But keep in mind the vegetation that you plant around the perimeter area of a drain field is actually helping to draw some of that moisture out of the ground.
Sure.
So it can be a synergetic,
Well,
and it's also fertilizer that's going into the ground.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking I'm a garlic farmer here.
Right.
You know, I sell at the farmer's market. Would it be, I mean, certainly you've got activity going on pretty far below the ground surface. If I planted corn or you know, crops, would that be an issue? Or do you maybe want to stick more with ornamentals and things like that?
Vine-based crops, or for example, tomatoes wouldn't be a problem, but crops that grow below ground, potatoes, onions, that sort of thing,
Carrots,
you would want to
beets.
avoid contact with
Sure.
the natural fertilizer from humans. So, but yeah, that's an option too.
Okay. Well, one of the things that has been big news in our lake country here is, you know, we have some of the most pristine lakes in Minnesota compared to some of the places in southern Minnesota, or even compared to the Brainerd Lake
Central
region.
area, yeah.
And what I've come to understand is that phosphorus can be a real, you know, dagger to the health of these lakes. And
Right.
how does something like phosphorus, one, where, I mean, it's naturally occurring, right?
Right.
How does the septic system stop phosphorus in its tracks from getting into our groundwater and our surface water?
Well, phosphorus is one of the ingredients in that effluent that flows out. So you can think of it as fertilizer. If you put fertilizer on your lawn, that's essentially phosphorus, and sometimes nitrates are a part of that as well. And
Potash, yep.
Yeah, and in sewage you have nitrates and phosphorus. As that wastewater percolates through the soil profile, those naturally occurring bacteria and vegetation will attach to those pathogens. It's food for the plants, and it's food for the bacteria. So it's a naturally occurring process of them consuming those pathogens in the wastewater if they have the oxygen present to support that bacteria.
And you know, so we're filming this right now in December. It's cold out there, but at a certain point, there's enough snow or straw or whatever that there is going to be oxygen even in the dead of winter for these bacteria to operate.
Yep.
Okay.
Below the frost, the ground's not frozen, and so that bacteria is somewhat temperature sensitive, so it might slow down somewhat.
Okay.
If you have a system that's struggling, colder weather might be a problem for it, but we don't see, unless the frost gets so deep to actually freeze the drain field out, we generally do not see problems in operation of a system in the wintertime.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, you had mentioned that between the pre-mid 90s and then when the University of Minnesota guidelines became code, that the systems, you know, some of those things changed, and one of the things was you went from having a minimum of 2 feet of the separation to 3 feet. What are some other nuts and bolts things that changed?
Well, the tanks themselves in the old days were not watertight, so groundwater could enter or wastewater could leach through the tank itself. They were simply blocks that were laid in a circular manner, most typically.
Like concrete blocks?
Yeah, tongue and groove blocks that would form a circle, kind of like a silo.
Sure.
And they would just place them without mortar, one row on top of the next, and put a lid on it. And at one point, they said, well, we need to have some sort of a floor. The early ones were just the dirt bottom.
Oh, okay.
And so obviously you had the potential for leaching through into the ground that way. So it was quite rudimentary. They would just open up a bag of Portland cement and rake it out on the bottom, and it would set up. You didn't mix it up or anything. It was just powder dry, and it would set up under the water, and it would form a layer about as thick as that piece of paper, and that was considered a sealed tank at one point probably in the 70s. And then at another point, and this was as they were learning more about rules and research and so on, then they said that the tanks needed to be what they called back plastered, and that was where they would just line the inside of it with a dry mortar. Again, it wasn't laid like a brick wall where you had mortar in between each block that was placed. It was just once everything was in place, you would line the inside of it, and those were considered a sealed tank. Well, finally they said, no, we want actual sealed tanks. Either the code describes it as made of materials that are decay proof. In the real world, we see either concrete or plastic tanks being used. And so one of the things that we look for is tanks that might be leaking when we pump a tank. And that could be through you have a pipe coming in, a pipe going out, you have access covers and inspection pipes coming to the surface. So there are potential leakage points on each tank. And another important change with these new tanks was accessibility. In the old days, you just had hopefully you had a pipe coming to the surface, and that was your clean out port. Well, you could put a hose in there and you could suck it out, but you couldn't really see how well you were doing unless you dug it up and took the cover off and really cleaned it out. But the new tanks are required to have a manhole cover, and now the code has evolved to the point where you have multiple manhole covers on the newer tanks. So typically 2 or 3. And so you can really see in the tank, you can diagnose problems easier if there's an issue with the pipe coming in, or if you have to work on a pump or something like that, we have access into the tank.
Well, let's say I'm living out in the country. I've got a subsurface septic system, and things seem to be working good. But I just I want to know. You want to
take care of it,
right?
Yep.
Do I just see if it is compliant? I mean, it seems like compliant and actually effective and safe. They're almost kind of little
independent issues, right? Compliant really only refers to the fact that that system does not pollute the groundwater.
Okay.
The code, the checklist for the code, when an inspector comes to look at things, they're looking to make sure that that tank is watertight and that you have the separation in the soil, and that there are no obvious issues with that system in terms of pollution. But in terms of operation or performance or serviceability or any of those things, it's not on their radar at all. So a compliance inspection is not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't give you the full picture of that system.
Okay.
It's only one aspect of it. As far as maintaining a system goes, the most common question I get after I pump a tank is, what should I add to it to get it working again?
Sure.
And the answer is quite simply, you don't need to add anything.
Okay.
Just use it as normal. The balance is there naturally from all of your wastewater use in the house. The toilet, the showers, laundry, all of the things that we use water for. Now, the balance can go out of whack if you're using a lot of cleaning products, or the toilet usage is somewhere else rather than at home, and all you see is cleaning products. Where we really notice it is these group homes, especially memory care units, where they have 3 problems. They have a lot of people, they have a lot of cleaning, and they have a lot of medication. And so those are negatives for the system. The only answer for that is to maintain it more frequently by pumping it more often.
Okay.
And some of those larger group homes, we have to pump them twice a year.
Okay.
Just to stay ahead of the problems.
But for a typical 3-bedroom, 4-person family, every other year?
They have a real simple formula. The state has come, and they've done it a lot of different ways. The official requirement, and it's actually written into the code, it's not enforced, but the code says that the owner or owner's agent shall measure the accumulation of solids in the tank at least every 3 years.
Okay.
Well, nobody does that.
Well,
and when the volume gets to 25%, it's time to pump.
Okay.
Well, they've simplified that by saying if it's a house with just one person or perhaps a seasonal cabin, you can go 3 years.
Okay.
And if it's 2 to 4 people, you can go 2 years. If it's more than 4 people, you should be pumping every year. I find that to be pretty accurate based on what I see in terms of that 25% of volume of solids in the tank. So.
Now, when we were talking earlier, you had mentioned about a 3-bedroom house that would be designed for 450 gallons a day.
That's the typical design flow for a 3-bedroom home.
Okay.
At 4 bedrooms, it goes to 650 or 600 gallons a day, I believe.
Okay.
So what they're trying to do is guesstimate an average or typical family's usage, and that figure has been modified through the years based on trial and error, what works and what doesn't work, and it's been raised from a lesser amount to a 3-bedroom home is now 450 gallons. They figure that that's about half of the normal daily usage for a family of 4. Some are, some aren't.
Yeah.
And every family is different with their water usage.
No one is average.
Right. So that figure is designed to build in somewhat of a safety margin for, you might have a big group of people over and it can handle those surges in activity. Now, we get in this area, especially in the summertime, a lot of people are having graduation parties or big get-togethers, reunions, whatever.
Yeah.
And what I tell people is, if you know that you're going to have 40 people at your house, it's not a bad idea to pump the tank the day before everybody gets there.
Sure.
And that way, it takes, a typical tank is 1,000 gallons. It takes 1,000 gallons of usage to fill it back up. So your drain field doesn't necessarily feel the impact of 40 people all in one day.
Okay.
And so there are little things like that you can do to help it out as well.
Now, you had talked about, well, actually you hadn't talked about it. I've read that the average, lifespan of a system is 20 to 30 years.
It can be.
Okay. Or it can be less.
It can be a lot less. I've seen systems fail in as little as 7 years for lack of pumping.
Okay.
And the usage was such that what happens when you ignore the pumping maintenance, it's a lot like when you ignore the oil change on your car. You can be unaware of any issues. In other words, you're driving along just fine. It's been 5 years since you've changed your oil, your car starts and it drives every day, your toilet flushes every day, but all of a sudden when it breaks, the end is sudden and catastrophic and expensive. It's the same with both. When that red light comes on and your car makes a funny noise, it's going to be an expensive repair. When your system either backs up or starts to bubble up out of the ground, it's an expensive repair.
Yeah.
And so the ongoing maintenance is basically like an oil change. It continues to, it keeps the system cleaned out so you're not introducing a lot of that sludge into the drain field, which tends to plug up the soil.
Sure.
And when that happens, initially what happens is it starts to make the drain field smaller, and then ultimately your water usage becomes greater than what it can handle.
Because that sludge is keeping the oxygen from being available to the little microbes down there that are,
It plugs up the soil basically.
All right.
Yep.
So let's say you are doing things right and you do, you pump every 2 years and you've got a compliant system, but Do you only know when a septic system is no longer functional when bad stuff starts to happen?
Yeah, odors, bad flushes, and problems out in the yard, any of those types of things, backing up, all of those would be big red flags.
Okay.
And of course we would generally get called to check it out, and sometimes it's a minor issue, and sometimes they're at the end of their life.
And so if it's at the end of its life, then what happens? You just get the excavator come in and just...
Well, some people will address that issue right away and, have a new system installed. Some people can limp along by increasing their pumping frequency. Mm-hmm. I've got some customers that pump as needed or as often as 2 or 3 times a year to avoid that expense of having to replace the system. Mm-hmm. It's a Band-Aid that will allow them to get along for a while.
For a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Well, I do know that there is a program that Itasca County is going to be offering in 2020. These are for folks that currently have a system that has not been assessed for compliance. Now again, there's that difference between compliance and function.
Right.
But it has not been tested for that in a while. And this is a program, it's a 0% interest loan where folks get this test, find out if they're compliant or not, they fail, and then this loan has an application fee, but it gets spread out over 10 years on their taxes, basically, kind of just like your property tax assessments. Yep. And so we haven't really talked prices of what systems are, and of course it's going to vary on your soil or something like that, but there looks to be some programs that are coming up soon in 2020, as well as some that have been available in the past.
Yeah, we've seen where low income or people that just can't quite afford a new system, but yet they have an imminent health threat because of their system, or a serious problem with their septic system needs to be changed out. There are programs out there available, low interest loans, possibly grants. It's not really my area of specialty, but I know Itasca County has resources available, possibly Itasca.
Yep.
There would be some places to check into that.
Well, as a realtor, I know that septic can be it can end people, especially if they're coming from an area where they've never been on a septic system, they're freaked out about it. And so, it's something that when I have clients that want to list a rural home, or a home, not even rural per se,
they don't have
but
to be rural
to be on septic. Yep. But getting that compliance certificate is really important. So I'm hoping that this program, it's actually $500,000 that's going to be made available to people. It will be something that they'll kind of preemptively get a new system and not be shocked when something fails. Yep. And then someone who's put an offer on their house, which is otherwise perfect, take it away.
Well, it can be a deal breaker on a real estate transaction.
Oh yeah.
And I get the question all the time, do you think my system will pass if I have it inspected? Well, my license is not as an inspector, but I can generally offer an opinion. Whether that, you can't really do much with my opinion, but I can tell you if it definitely will not pass based on the age and the components that are there. What I tell folks, if you're selling your home and you're worried about the septic system passing, if you can afford it, you're wise to upgrade it before you list the house. And the reason for it is, number one, it makes the house easier to sell.
Yeah.
And number two, it adds value to your home. Just like if you were to put on a new roof or a big deck or any added feature, it's going to add value. So ideally, the payback should be there. It should be reflected in the selling price.
Well, now I've heard it thrown out there that probably 40% of septic systems that were built before 1996 are non-compliant.
I would say it's higher than that.
Higher than that, okay.
Yeah, because the code didn't really exist. There were only a handful of installers that were actually building towards the code that was on the way.
Okay. So yeah, I know when I am looking at a listing and it's always worked great. Yeah, it's only 30 years ago. And
never had to worry about it because everything worked.
So well, we've kind of talked about some of the financial options that are out there, but what kind of prices do what kind of range and compared it to the kind of system you have, what are we talking about?
I would say on average, and there is no set price necessarily. Absolutely. Because you have different installers. It's a bid process, and each site is unique. If you have a large hill or special circumstances on your site that require more material or more time, obviously that's going to increase the value or the cost. On average, we see mound systems in that $10,000 to $12,000 range.
Okay.
Like I said, gravity systems are still an option if you have the right soil, and they would be less expensive, not quite half, maybe $6,000 to $8,000 for a gravity system. You have much of the same components, but less material and less time on a gravity system.
All right.
So that's where the savings comes in. And because it is a bid situation, you can always get more than one bid. When they do build a new system, there are a few professionals that get involved. There's what they call a designer.
Right.
That would be similar to an architect, where they come and look at the site, they look at the soil, and that's one area of the code that's improved within the last, 5 or 6 years, where they do what they call a soil verification pit. They actually dig a hole and look at the soil profile, whereas in the past they would just auger down and take a small core sample out. Well, you can get a much better picture of the soil by looking at the side profile of it, and both the designer and the county official agree. So it's not just one opinion, it's two people agreeing on the conditions of the soil. And so they take into account the size of the house, if there's any rivers or lakes, shoreline that would be affected. They look at all of the setbacks between the well and your lake and your property lines and buildings and all of those sorts of things. And then they actually design the system just much like an architect would design your home. And so that is handed off then to an installer who would build to that spec, and finally an inspector would come in and make sure that it was all done according to the design. So. And
then I believe after a system is installed in Itasca County, it is compliant for 3 years? Does that sound right?
I think it's 2.
Is it 2?
Well, I could be mistaken. Because I'm not an inspector, I don't get involved in that as much. It's either 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And I'm confused because there's an inspection is good for so many years. If you have it done, say you're listing your house, you have it inspected, and the house doesn't sell, and you relist it again in a year, that inspection would still be good for
it's my
a period of time.
2 years.
It might be 2, yeah. So. An inspector could answer that question better than I can.
Okay. Well, I know we're just kind of bouncing back and forth. I mean, we could have this conversation for quite some time, but I think it's something that when you have something below ground, you've already said out of sight, out of mind. It's easy not to worry about it.
Well, and when the toilet works, you've got life goes on. You've got other things on your mind, and that's not something people dwell on necessarily until it stops working. And that's a big part of why these systems were largely ignored for so many years, because they worked.
Yeah.
And I've used the example with people, and sometimes it gets frustrating for not only for me, but for the folks that are trying to understand why do I have to spend $10,000 on something that I don't think I need, because my system has worked great all of these years. And I mentioned to you earlier what I tell folks, especially if they're living on a lake, you could have a pipe connected from your toilet right off the end of your dock, and that would work forever without any problems also. But that's not how we do it.
Yeah.
And there's reasons for it. If you had it visually like that, you wouldn't accept it. but that's what was happening underground and people were not aware of.
Well, and from my realtor's standpoint, the attraction of our area here is that things are as pristine as they are,
right.
And it is so much cheaper to do prevention,
right.
than it is to try and fix some of these streams and lakes that are already got
right.
too much phosphorus and nitrates,
right.
and algae and things like that.
Coming back to, you mentioned phosphorus, what was one of the impacts or the problems with it? It's essentially a fertilizer, and so when it gets into the lakes, you have all of these vegetation blooms and growths
mm-hmm.
that get out of control because you're introducing fertilizer to the lake. And so if we can filter that out ahead of time, and of course there's other folks at Itasca Water that can give a lot of information on buffers and shoreline management that also will improve water quality as well. But with septics, we're dealing not only with that environmental issue, but it's also a public health issue.
Absolutely.
And stuff that you can get really sick from. And the kind of sick you don't want to be. So,
well, I just find it so interesting that, of course, you're talking about getting sick. That could be from bacteria, and yet it's the bacteria in the soil that are capturing those nutrients, that phosphorus, those nitrates, nitrites, whatever.
We hear about probiotics. There's good bacteria and bacteria that can make us sick. So that's a...
Well, I want to thank you for being here and talking about these sorts of things, Mike. And again, we could go on, but my guest has been Mike Casey, Bunes Septic Service. And if you'd like more information about Itasca County shorelands, how to keep your shoreland healthy, and maintaining and growing your property's value, you can go to our website, itascawaters.org. The site has tons of useful links to all kinds of resources, and it's simple to navigate. Our next program will deal with private forest management and the benefits that good management can have on keeping our waters clean and healthy. Check ICTV listings for when that program will air. I'm Jesse Davis. Thanks for watching Itasca Waters on Itasca Community Television.